So let's talk fancy jump packs from the sky bearing relic weapons into battle. Are Vanguard veterans really that bad in Warhammer 40k? And which competitive lists tend to use them? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Vanguard veterans, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of the Space Marine datasheet, talk through their datasheet rules, any obvious buffs and synergies, obvious competition against the jump intercessors, and when and how they tend to get used in the competitive game. The Vanguard veterans are basically the Space Marines jump melee veterans. They've often been a pretty relevant unit for the Astartes, a rapid response force that hits really hard with weapons drawn from the finest things that the chapter has to offer, and in game that's often wound up being a good thing for them, hitting harder than average Space Marine battle line troops and getting that melee exactly where it needs to be on the wings of a jump pack. They're easier to deliver where they need to compared with most. The current kit from Games Workshop is £37, €47.50 or $60. A bit pricey for slightly older models maybe, though kind of in line with several 5-man jump pack offerings. The points per dollar at the moment isn't particularly high at around about 1.8, slightly on the pricier side for Space Marines. There's a fair few things that tend to be around about that sort of bracket, including plenty of their 3-man and 5-man infantry box sets. At the moment, the Vanguard veterans have the slightly dubious honour of being one of the last holdouts for firstborn Space Marine releases. In terms of ones that are super obvious for an update, especially these guys, Tactical Marines, Devastators, and the Terminator Assault Squad, and I think that there's a very, very high chance they get a Primaris scale update, either in 11th edition or potentially later in 10th if Games Workshop want to get ahead of themselves. There does often seem to be a minor Space Marine release late in the edition, as we had with Brutalis Dreadnoughts and Desolation Squads last time around. Model kit wise, I'd say they're actually quite a useful one as Space Marines go. They have a huge amount of war gear available on their sprues, with lots of lightning claws, thunder hammers, storm shields, and power weapons of various descriptions on offer. And it means that whatever loadout you do build out of these, you'll be left with a fair few interesting bits that you can use for other conversions or kit bashing characters or something. And I feel like that makes them a bit more interesting than most for collectors. Nevertheless, I still think it's a bit of a turn-off knowing that there's a pretty reasonable chance that they get a miniature update sometime within the next 2 to 3 years or so. It might push them down the priority list for some people who don't want to get these specific sculpts before they go. In any case, if you were looking to pick up some Vanguard veterans or anything else for your 40k armies, there's plenty of channel discount links in the video description, different discount retailers that offer Games Workshop miniatures for somewhere between 10 and 20% off around the world. Places like Element Games in the UK, Wargame Portal in the USA, and Gap Games in Australia. Generally worth buying through these versus the Games Workshop web store direct, given that you save direct money and get the same things. Anyone using these specific stores with the links down in the video description help to support Auspex Tactics as well, and a big thank you to any of you guys choosing to do that. It is part of the whole thing that keeps these videos coming. In any case, model kits aside, let's get on to the rules for the squad. The Vanguard Veteran Squad with jump packs have the profile of sort of standard Space Marine Assault Marine type units, a 12-inch move with fly due to their jump packs, and then the standard Astartes profile of 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save. They only get objective control 1 as they're not battle line troops or anything. The squad costs 105 points to field in game, or 210 points for a squad of 10 of them, so they certainly pay a big premium versus the jump intercessors, which I feel like are their most natural rivals right now. You get 5 to 10 models in the squad, and otherwise they do come with built-in deep strike as well thanks to those jump packs. That can be interesting to potentially keep them off the board and jump them in with rapid ingress, or just use that fast movement and fly to bounce up the board between terrain and keep hidden until they get to strike hard. For war gear choices, their melee weapons are fairly set, but they do get the choice between pistols or shields. Basically, each Vanguard veteran can either take a plasma pistol, inferno pistol, hand flamer, or grav pistol, or swap all those fancy sidearms out for a storm shield. Out of those choices, I feel like the hand flamer and grav pistol are kind of low yield compared with the rest. I guess hand flamers could have them go on super anti-horde mode, but they do that fairly well with their melee weapons anyway. I'd be more tempted by either the inferno pistol or the plasma pistol. I think Inferno would probably be my favourite despite the short range, a single shot at strength 8, AP 4 and damage D3, potentially +2 if you get super close with Melter, or the Plasma Pistol where you're hitting at strength 7, AP 2, damage 1 on the base profile, and you can overcharge if it makes sense to strength 8 and damage 2. That would probably make sense if you were shooting at something like enemy Space Marines. I think I'd be a little bit wary of doing that against some slightly suboptimal targets for them, as you'd be taking loads of hazardous rolls for maybe not really all that much gain. All of that has to be weighed up against the Storm Shield for a 4+ invulnerable save, and that just makes the unit just kind of unusually tanky, particularly against things that tend to kill Space Marines pretty well, like say a Melter or Plasma Fire, and I'd personally be more tempted by the Storm Shield out of the two. I feel like overall it's a greater source of strength, just means that once they've jumped in and done a bunch of damage, they're going to take a fair bit more focus firepower to remove, and does make the standard Astartes stat line a bit more intimidating. For melee damage, they get 4 attacks at Strength 5, AP 1, Damage 1 with their heirloom weapons. I must admit that was a bit disappointing to see at the start of the edition. I don't think I was really against having a little bit of consolidation, with maybe their fancy weapons being locked in under 1 or 2 profiles, but the fact that they both got AP 1 and Damage 1 were a bit underwhelming really. I feel like power swords for the most part would usually imply AP 2 at the very least, never mind the fact that you could have an entire squad visually armed with Thunderhammers, which are usually a pretty crazy strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, so just vastly different from this heirloom weapon kind of profile. I think people would have quite liked to see either a bit more AP or a bit more damage, or even both, or perhaps something like a distinct profile for the Sergeant's Relic Blade, which has often been a particularly fun bit of war gear in the past, and I feel like it's this profile that turns a lot of people off them. At base without any buffs, it is a bit lackluster to be honest. It's good against hordes, though not really good against heavies, though they do at least get lethal hits on the charge when they jump into combat, and that does mean that they're at least a little bit better at scraping wounds off tough monsters and vehicles than they would otherwise be. You can't rely on it if the enemy's charging you rather than the other way around, of course, though. For their damage output, completely unbuffed, 5 Space Marines on the charge will kill around about 8 Termagants, around about 2 or 3 Space Marine Intercessors, around about 1 Terminator, and about 2 or 3 wounds off a Toughness 10 Predator tank. Overall, I feel like for the primary damage output of supposedly elite melee veterans, it's just not really very impressive here. Even against preferred targets, they're sort of killing around about 40 odd points worth of models, which is a bit on the lackluster side, and the low strength and low AP does make them suffer against high saves or high toughness, though admittedly they can get quite a lot better with various buffs out there. Overall, for their strengths and weaknesses, I'd say their biggest strengths are that they have fast movement and built-in deep strike, okay volume of attacks with lethal hits, and that lethal hits bonus will apply to any attached characters as well, which would make them hit a bit harder than otherwise with power fists and things. They get the choice of either extra damage in fancy pistols or extra durability in storm shields, of which I prefer the storm shields of the two. And then beyond that, they're not a bad unit for big synergy type things, say Kavar Shrike leading them, Blood Angels getting good value out of Sons of Sanguinius, or maybe being one of the first company units for that detachment. I'd say the main downside is they're just not very general purpose for the price tag, with low strength, AP and damage, meaning that they're skewed towards infantry outside of other buffs, and they have the competition of the much cheaper jump intercessors, which I think are pretty well known to have very good stats in their own right. For standard Space Marine support type things, they can use Oath of Moment to re-roll the hit rolls, though basically anything can do that. I guess they only hit on a 3+ normally, so they're going to be one of the better targets, and easy access to lethal hits does mean that occasionally that if they're just wounding their foe on a 6, it's going to make mathematical sense to re-roll everything that isn't a lethal hit to try and get as many auto wounds as possible. Otherwise, for supporting stratagems, they could use Armour of Contempt, but if they're taking Storm Shields, it's a bit less relevant. Grenades could give them a little bit of extra punch against really tough armoured units, being extra good against the things that they're weakest against with high toughness and saves. And probably the standout stratagem for them might be Rapid Ingress, allowing them to deep strike somewhere safe in some terrain, and basically 100% knowing that their good movement will get them a nice charge on an important enemy unit next turn. A fairly scary prospect for the opponent. Really though, I feel like their main synergies come from characters and a couple of detachments. In the core codex, they have 3 really quite usable buffing characters that do work well alongside them. The Jump Captain for 85 points is quite nice with their free stratagems, could be used for things like the Lance stratagem and extra AP and Gladius potentially, and they also get +1 strength on the charge, which gets them to strength 6, which is really quite a nice breakpoint, wounding Terminators on 3s, toughness 3 infantry on 2s, and toughness 10 and 11 vehicles on 5s rather than 6s. They also contribute 5 attacks with either a Power Fist or Thunderhammer as well, which will get lethal hits on the charge, and that's definitely a big help against tough targets they might otherwise struggle with a bit. Otherwise, for a cheaper option, the Jump Chaplain's also very nice. They get a Power Fist again for a bit of extra high quality melee, +1 to wound against everything. Again, it's a bit more of a direct bonus than the +1 strength, and then a little bit of bonus mortal wound when fighting doesn't hurt either. Out of the two, I think I slightly prefer the Jump Captain over the Chaplain to support them, though there's maybe not too much in it, and the Chaplain is cheaper. Finally, if you happen to be playing Vanguard, Kayvan Shrike has these guys and the Jump Intercessors as his favoured units. He grants the unit Lone Operative style protection, which means that they're just really quite a big nasty synergy unit. They should almost certainly be able to get the charge on the enemy rather than the other way around with that going on, and then hopefully it shouldn't be as easy to just counter-attack and delete off the table, particularly if they've got storm shields, and things that are right by them might struggle a bit. He also contributes a bunch of Twin Links precision damage 2 attacks with his lightning claws, and again he won't be adverse to the lethal hits that they give him on the charge. I feel like all of these are usable enough, and I think that if you're taking Vanguard veterans in the first place, it probably makes sense to give them a character. If you just want a cheap skirmish unit, then the Jump Intercessors will generally do that better for you. For detachment synergies, they definitely have a bit more focus on some detachments rather than others for Codex Space Marines. I feel like Gladius is actually genuinely one of the better ways to run them, as accessing Advance and Charge is really strong to be able to ban them across the board, plus they get on very well with the Lance and Extra AP stratagem for 1 CP and Assault Doctrine. Having all those Strength 5 attacks, or maybe Strength 6 with a Jump Captain, or being +1 to Wound and AP -2, just makes them fantastically more general purpose than they would be otherwise. Beyond that, Stormlance can get them Advance and Charge. First Company does have some useful stuff, like the +1 to hit stratagem or the -1 damage stratagem. That could be quite an impactful one if something charges them with a bunch of damage 2 attacks. Between Storm Shields and -1 damage, you might be hitting back with quite a lot of Marines after that. Otherwise, Vanguard has some infantry supporting stratagems, and getting a bit of durability at long range isn't the worst. Firestorm could potentially use the +1 to wound if desired, but that does work on a whole bunch of units. As ever with jump pack things though, I feel like the most standout way to use the Vanguard veterans is probably with Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius right now, or maybe a bit of a tie between these guys and Kayvan Shrike with Raven Guard if you're using him. As ever with Space Marine Assault things, Sons of Sanguinius just makes them way scarier. +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge in addition to those lethal hits means that you're getting 5 attacks at strength 7, AP 1, damage 1. And if you have a full unit of them with an attached character, that's probably going to be enough dangerous attacks to take out the vast majority of medium-sized threats in the game in a single round of combat. And then compared with a bunch of the other jump infantry on offer for the Blood Angels, they might be a bit harder to kill in return for their points cost. They cost far less than Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, and still get the 4+ invulnerable saves that they have. So while they do sacrifice a lot of damage compared with those two, they're also a lot tougher for the points and a bit more resistant to the counter-attack. In particular for them, the Sanguinary Priest can attach to them. A 5+ Feel No Pain and extra AP is exactly what these guys will get on well with. Having all of those Strength 7 attacks at AP 2 is a really big deal. And if you really wanted to go all in, you could go for Sanguinary Priest plus another character. You could use Dante or a Jump Captain potentially. That's certainly a bit of an all-in unit with a massive points investment, but you do get a bunch of Storm Shields with a 5+ Feel No Pain, an AP that's far more general purpose with very high strength. You'd be strength 8 on the charge with all those combos in play. The Blood Angels have lots of rivals for jump packs, Jump Intercessors, Death Company, Assault Intercessors on foot, and Blade Guard. It does seem that Vanguard veterans do occasionally get used in competitive lists for them. They definitely have their pros and cons and trade-offs, but between 4+ invulnerable saves and 5+ Feel No Pains, and all the big damage that the detachment can give, it does seem that there's enough to make them interesting. You can also use Red Rampage as well, which maybe doesn't fit with them quite as well as a few of the other Blood Angels units, but it's still going to add up to a very big damage buff whether you're on the charge or whether you're locked in combat. You get the lethal hits even if you were charged, and you get the +1 to wound when you're on the charge as well. Both of those I think are good enough to warrant the inclusion against tough stuff. Otherwise for the Divergent chapters, I feel like they're still interesting for the melee focused ones. Black Templars have got some good combat support and can get a vow where they could have maybe sustained and lethal hits at the same time if they wanted to. Again, just the Feel No Pain's quite good as well, as it means they're far more resilient to damage 2 weapons. They've got some nice melee support such as extra AP, which they really like, and surge moves. Space Wolves have a lot of the similar stuff as well. Very powerful now they start in one of the sagas and Champions of Rust, and again with access to an extra AP stratagem that could also give Lance as well, it can make them hit a lot harder. AP is perhaps the biggest deal. Besides that, Dark Angels could have some love for the Inner Circle Task Force, given that they get the +1 to wound bonus from that, and Deathwatch gets some damage boost as well, though I feel like you kind of overrun with veteran style datasheets in that army. Within Codex Space Marines, they do have a very obvious rival in the Jump Intercessors that were released at the start of 10th. I feel like the existence of these guys tends to get people to overlook the Vanguard veterans altogether for army building quite a lot of the time, I feel like for most armies that don't have some big synergies that you can put around the Vanguard veterans, they are going to be better. A similar sort of stat line, but with strength 4 attacks rather than strength 5 and no lethal hits, but they can still take a couple of plasma pistols in the unit, and importantly get a power fist on the sergeant, and a bunch of mortal wounds handed out per models that you can get into engagement range, and that again can help them out against tougher targets. Between all that, they can out-damage them at base if literally all the squad can charge into engagement range, both against tougher targets and against lighter things, which is maybe kind of embarrassing for the Vanguard veterans, being outdone by the rank and file. Plus, if you want to have a cheap unit to be jumping around doing secondaries and skirmishing with lighter enemy units, then the jump intercessors certainly seem like the way to go there. If you do want to have a really big squad though, then I feel like the differences do lessen a bit. In a big squad of 10 you only get one power fist, so it's not quite as much of a factor versus the Vanguard veterans. You're not very likely to get all the models into engagement range when you charge them in, so you're not going to get quite as many mortal wounds there, where the Vanguard veterans will still be getting all their lethal hits. And getting storm shields is quite a big deal, not being able to be hit back and removed from the board quite as easily as the jump intercessors is rather nice. Overall, with their rules and points at the way they are, I'd rate them as niche but not completely unplayable. As mentioned, I've certainly seen plenty of competitive lists actually using Vanguard veterans, though for the most part they do tend to be the chapters that have the opportunity to boost their melee by quite a bit, far more commonly in things like Blood Angels, or maybe one of the Space Wolves or Black Templars at a pinch, at least more so than say standard Ultramarines Gladius, where perhaps if you want melee units, you might be better with something with a bit more AP and damage too, perhaps. I still say that I prefer the jump intercessors as the overall datasheet. They're just massively easy to include in Space Marine armies right now, particularly with actions on the go. But if you did want a big danger unit in Blood Angels or maybe Raven Guard with Shrike, I feel like the differences aren't that much. You certainly could still use the jump intercessors for the big unit role, though I definitely feel like Vanguard veterans have their niche and are really quite usable for a slightly tankier danger unit that can still threaten to wipe out most normal sized threats when buffed. If I were using them in game, I'd certainly take a character, maybe a jump captain at the first port of call, depending on what else you have from the chapter, maybe a sanguinary priest from Blood Angels, and then use them as a big dangerous focal squad for stratagems and buffs. Maybe looking at the opponent's army as to whether or not to rapid ingress them. I think that if you were going for a big investment unit, I'd be very tempted to have them jump down onto the board turn 2 behind terrain, and then get to work on one of the enemy's units with basically no way that they can stop them. Compared with a bunch of scary melee threats out there, like say maybe things like Blood Angel's Death Company, they'd have to pick their targets a bit more, or they'd quite like to not be going into things that they're wounding on 6s or have a 2+ save. But with buffs they can certainly chip away at those sort of things really quite nicely, just might be a little bit less likely to wipe them out in one single turn. Hopefully they can do enough damage that when they're sat there in the open afterwards, the opponent's going to struggle to remove them too easily. And even if they do manage to wipe the squad, hopefully the Storm Shields make it so they soak up enough firepower that important other things in your army don't have as many things go after them. In any case, let me know what you make of them and their datasheet in 10th edition. Have you used them in any games yourself so far? Or have you been more swayed by other Space Marine damage dealers that get a bit more damage and AP? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments and how you'd rate them. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the links are down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.